Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Feeling Lighter podcast. I'm Coach Tyler here today with Dr. Lisa, as always. Dr. Lisa, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing really good. And I'm excited today because we talk about this a lot to our members that we shape, especially to the people who go through our feel-good challenges. And, the way I look at it is our experiences create our beliefs, and our beliefs change our decisions, and our decisions change our actions, and our actions create the outcomes of our life. But there's a little space between the experiences that we have and the beliefs that we gather from those experiences. And depending on how we decide to experience those things and create those beliefs, ultimately can drive us certain directions in our life and make us make reactionary decisions and things like that may not end up serving us. So I'm really excited today because we're going to talk about some of this, especially around the topic of trauma and how that ultimately drives us sometimes directions that we don't want to go. So I'm super excited today to welcome Dr. Deniz. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah. So to start out, why don't you just start by sharing with our listeners, how did you get into this? Was this like a personal growth journey that, led you down this path, or what got you to the place where you started focusing on helping people change their trauma, transform their trauma?
I've had two versions of this answer throughout my life, which is connected to the topic we're discussing. I used to be
give us the version that's more fun.
Well, I'm gonna give you both so you can hear the contrast.
Okay.
You can hear where there was the lack of awareness. I used to believe that I got into this field simply because I had this curiosity about people, which is not false, and that my curiosity came from more of just observing family issues and diverse cultures within my family and how people communicated differently. What I had not realized at the time was that so many of my wounded parts were what led me into this work, seeking answers that I may not have gotten otherwise, or access to education and information. So the honest answer is that it really was so much of my own childhood trauma that kind of subconsciously led me into a field where I could get answers to understand myself and my own experiences, but also the roles that I played in my family. You ask any therapist or coach even, we tended to play some version of a role of caretaker, listener, or parentified child, that for someone to dedicate their whole life to a profession of support and holding space and listening, it really is something that you start with very early on in your life. So I share that because we're talking about beliefs and trauma today, and so many of these things can be out of our awareness for so long, so under the surface, even as someone who is in the field. So I just wanted to share that I am human too, and all these, we are all built the same, despite so many of our differences. So you are not alone if you're someone who is just starting to recognize these things about yourself, or maybe doesn't even know where some of those blind spots are yet.
I love that you said that, because I feel like our pain can often become our purpose. And when I see people who are in alignment with healing themselves and then supporting others in a similar journey, I tend to see people who seem like they're really on their path. They're really excited about their path. You don't need motivation or inspiration to continue down the path, because you're doing what served you in such a meaningful way, and it's positively impacting others. So I'm super happy that you said that and you're on that pathway, because we need more people to face their pain, turn it into their passion, and serve others in that capacity.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you for doing
We should do a poll on that, how many people who are parentified children end up in these professions, these helping, because it makes a lot of sense to hear you say it that way. Definitely. Can we kind of back up just a little bit? I know we talk about trauma a lot, but I think it's kind of one of those words, toxic, kind of gets used a lot.
Yeah.
I would love if you could just sort of help our listeners understand what trauma is, from the big to the small, and what it looks like, how it shows up and impacts your life, especially as it relates to childhood during those very, important, years of growth and development.
Absolutely. So generally, we might define trauma as any event or experience, whether something is a single event or prolonged, ongoing, that overwhelms your nervous system's capacity to cope. And this can be the presence of something difficult or bad, but it can also be the absence of good things, like the necessary ingredients of love and affection and attention. So that, I think, is a more recent expansion of our definition to recognize that it's not just the bad things that might happen or the sort of more explicit traumatic events that are really easy for most of us to tag as like, that was really hard, that was horrible, that was a loss. But the absence of things, especially in childhood, because when something's absent from your early years, you never know that it exists. It is just your norm. It's almost like the water that a fish swims in. It's just all around you. So you don't have any reference point to recognize that something is lacking, even if internally you feel like something's off, or you feel like there's something different about you, or you feel isolated in your experience in some way. It's so difficult to put words to that and to name that. So those, I mean, depending on the trauma, your experience can affect you in so many different ways. And even two people going through the same traumatic event or experience, that can manifest quite differently for them, depending on a number of circumstances. But generally, my specialty is really childhood trauma. So I will talk more about when these experiences happen in early childhood. Whether it happens with a caregiver or someone who is really integral in your life, or someone who's supposed to be a safe adult in your life, that has a profoundly different impact than if we have like a single event trauma later in life as an adult. For many reasons. Your nervous system is still developing as a child, right? So the experiences that you have are actively shaping the architecture of your brain and your nervous system. And in those early relationships is where we start to develop this blueprint of relationships and how we see the world, how we come to see ourselves. And this is where that connection between the nervous system and our belief system is so important, because if we have early experiences that break or shatter our sense of safety, our sense of trust, or the nervous system needs to be hypervigilant all the time, those experiences, whether they're just repeated or they're a single impactful event, start to plant the seeds of how your nervous system is primed to function through adulthood, as well as the seeds of your belief systems, because that is your template as you move into adulthood. That's where you learn all of these things. And especially if you have to remain in those environments where that trauma is ongoing, or a trauma is denied, people are unsafe, needs continue to be unmet, your nervous system ends up essentially getting locked into a state of survival, whether that's your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So you don't have the same experience of coming out of a survival state, because that's really what our bodies are meant to do, is to sort of pendulate back and forth between regulation and states of survival. But when you have chronic or really impactful trauma in early childhood, we get stuck there. And that's where we start to see, those beliefs grow and get more generalized and have all these arms to different places in our life, as well as you start to see the physical effects later on of how being in a chronic state of stress and survival impacts the body.
Can we talk about those physical effects? Because I don't think everybody is acutely aware of, what it looks like to be impacted by these traumas. And I mean, I think a lot of people are walking around very much unaware and kind of searching for answers outside of themselves for something that, really just needs to kind of be healed from the inside out. So what does it even look like?
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about what happens in the body to help us understand how it manifests the way that it does. When your body detects a perceived threat, and this all happens super fast and unconsciously. It's not something the brain consciously is doing. It's like this automatic system that's constantly scanning for threat. So when it detects something that it perceives as a threat, your body unconsciously kicks it into high gear, into survival, starting with your fight or flight response. When that happens, this is where you start to have all these physical reactions to essentially mobilize your body to get ready to fight or to run away. So certain systems in the body start to shut down, like your immune system, your reproductive system, your digestive system, essentially systems that your body deems to be non-essential in a moment of survival. Blood flows out to all your larger organs. As all that's happening, you have this cascade of release of hormones in the body, cortisol and adrenaline being two that people are very familiar with. Mm-hmm. So all of that is fantastic when you're running away from an actual threat, right? Like if there's a tiger in front of you, you want all that to happen and you want it to happen fast. The problem is, especially with childhood trauma, complex trauma, prolonged trauma, you don't return back down to baseline from that. So all of those things are chronically activated, right? Like think about, if I said to both of you, I want you to think about you're about to jump up out of your seats. Just notice what happens in your muscles right now, right? You might feel your back tense. You might feel like the hip flexors and psoas muscles start to tense a little bit. And that's just like a micro movement of being about to do it. So when you are chronically in these states, those systems I talked about that are non-essential can be heavily impacted. So we see people with suppressed immune functioning, right? With GI issues, muscle tension, pain, chronic pain, fatigue, all sorts of things that are impacted by chronic, not just trauma, but chronic stress as well. Yeah. And I want to make that clear because we live in a society that really promotes that. Like the fast pace that we live in, the stressors and expectations that we have on us, even outside of living in traumatic circumstances, really make the body so prone to being in that state of survival. And I want to be clear that when we talk about those experiences having an effect on the body, that is in no way to blame someone for having any of those conditions or experiences. It's never a singular cause of those kinds of things. It's usually a number of factors coming together, but we do know now more than ever, like our bodies are connected, right? It's like, It's not just the mind that's cut off from the rest of the body. There's such an interplay in terms of how they're connected, but unfortunately our medical system hasn't really caught up to that. We don't treat people in that way, whether it's in terms of treatment or prevention. But there is a huge component of how that impacts your physical health.
I like to think about the way that trauma kind of rules us as like, I'm an adult and I'm driving a car and I'm like choosing where I'm going. I'm conscious, I'm mindful. And then somebody, maybe it's my wife, says something to me that is deeply triggering. And then I feel all those physiological reactions and then boom, I'm asleep at the wheel. My child grabs on. I wake up 5 minutes later and I'm ran into a tree. You know what I mean? And like, that's really what ends up happening inside people's bodies is the trauma ends up basically making decisions for us to try and keep us safe based on old patterns and beliefs that we've held on to really tightly. And it leads us into really bad situations. Absolutely. And so if someone, one of the things that we like to teach people is that the first step is paying attention to your thoughts and beliefs and trying to understand the ones that are repetitive, right? And realize that there's something underneath that. There's like a root underneath this, right? So what is your process to helping people first recognize they have trauma, build the awareness around the ones that are important to tackle, and then unwind that? And you have 30 seconds to answer.
To give you all my theoretical orientation. So the process for building awareness for me is usually getting people embodied in some way. Yeah. Whether that's like a mindfulness practice, some form of movement, even just encouraging walks or being connected to nature, something that gets you present. Yeah. Especially because if you've had a lot of trauma, your capacity to be connected into your internal space is quite limited because your body feels so unsafe being inside of you, or your attention being inside of you. So depending on where someone's capacity is, we might enter that from some sort of different space. But the general answer is we're building some form of a noticing practice to notice your body sensations, your posture, your breathing, to notice your thinking and your thoughts. And what's really integral about that you're alluding to is it's that practice in and of itself that helps us start to build this observer capacity where we can watch our patterns come and go rather than getting caught in them right in the moment. And we all know that takes a tremendous amount of practice to be able to watch something versus being in it. But as you start to build that, you start to see patterns of, oh, when I'm around these people, this is how my nervous system feels. When I'm in these kinds of situations, these are the thoughts I find myself really ruminating on. So part of that awareness practice is also helping people make the connection between what's happening in their body and the thinking that's present all at the same time.
That's a big deal, but I have a question about this,
Yeah.
right? So I found out I had ADHD when I was 32 years old,
Okay.
right? And I'm like, okay, yeah, that explains the way that my brain works. And for years, I was trying all kinds of things to shift it, but, you know, the typical things like not being able to wait for someone to finish their sentence before you start the next one would come and present themselves. And to be frank, it was really starting to damage my relationships and the way I could show up. And as luck would have it, I texted the most calm person I knew and said, "How are you so damn calm?" And he introduced me to a mindfulness coach. And I worked with that mindfulness coach for years and actually became one of my closest friends as well. And all of that being said, the first 7 months that I was trying to start a mindfulness practice and like seriously disciplined every day, 20 minutes minimum, right? I was like, what is the point of this, right? I just sit down and be blah, 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 my brain just would go crazy, right? I'd even have to pause and take laps sometimes, right? Because I couldn't handle my own thoughts. And then after 7 months, I just had this one moment where it was like quiet for like a couple seconds. And I was like, oh, that's what being present is. That's what the difference between observer and being stuck in my thoughts is. And so I think that most people probably have a challenge understanding this concept of what does it mean to be an observer when we've just been living in these thoughts that we identify as who we are for so long. So how do you help people bridge that gap? Because I know a lot of people aren't going to go 7 months on this and you know, they'd probably just give up at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I so appreciate you sharing that experience because it's not something you can explain, right? Someone can tell you that's what's going to happen eventually, but that doesn't make a difference. It's like having this felt sense of having some slight separation between yourself and your experience. And I will say, depending on which therapeutic modality you're using, there's a number of different ways to do that. Like acceptance and commitment therapy uses a ton of metaphors and experiential practices to help people get space between themselves and their thinking. Parts work and inner child work, we do it more in terms of encapsulating those thoughts and feelings in terms of a younger part and having separation in that way. So there's this almost like externalization that we can use. So I would say there's no one way to do it. Sometimes it is through metaphor. Sometimes it is a moment where someone recognizes, hey, I had that thought, but I chose something different. And like there's that brief experience of, oh, so you can have a thought, but I choose not to follow it, right? Or I noticed myself getting activated and I had this urge to do this, but I chose to do this thing instead. Or I caught myself mid-urge and then I did this thing. So you start to get these little micro moments as people practice. And sometimes, I do think there's a difference sometimes in terms of practicing that observer stance towards your body versus your thoughts. Generally in mindfulness practice, we start with the body for the reason that your mind moves so
Yeah,
fast.
it's
It's
good to keep
so
up.
slippery. Your body tends to be a lot slower, more stable in terms of what it's giving you. So if you are someone who's like, I just can't get any of that space, I would say, like, give yourself permission to step back from your thinking and just focus on observing your body sensations. And you don't even have to do it in a formal practice. You can literally do it as you're like sitting at your desk. You close the car door and you put your hands on the wheel. Just a brief drop in of what's happening in your body.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop for a second.
Yeah.
I really like this. Yesterday, Tyler and I were going to dinner and we were talking about kids and how, just advanced they are in all of this awareness, not necessarily, their traumas as much. Although I feel like my kids are noticing
Say
traumas.
some guru stuff to me sometimes. I'm just like, damn.
They are shocking, which is, I guess, a testament to, the work each generation does in this area to try to identify our triggers or activators and be mindful and aware and connect all the dots. And I think it's great. I want to fast forward to having this awareness, really, really sitting in your thoughts around your traumas, understanding yourself deeply, and then recognizing that the people around you may not be on that path. And on your Instagram, you talk a lot about managing in like dysfunctional family situations, and because we can only control what happens here for to some extent, and our responses, we cannot control the other people. So I would love to know the wisdom that you share with people who are gaining all this beautiful awareness in their own stuff and then dealing with people who have no interest in that and how to sort of manage and operate, in these family systems, sometimes maybe your work, situation, whatever it is. How are you to show up with this new sense of awareness around all these people that don't care?
She's asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend.
I love this question. And honestly, in my group program, my inner child group program, this is something we talk about so much because people are in the thick of their healing work and they're going through the growing pains of it in their relationships. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some small part of most of us that wants to show up and be like, look at me, look at all this wonderful work I'm doing, look how awesome I'm doing. And we just want everyone to meet us with open arms. But unfortunately, there are many people in your life that are going to have a reaction to you being a different version of yourself. And sometimes it's a version of yourself that no longer serves them or benefits them, or a version of yourself that they can no longer control the same way. I think there's different categories of what this looks like. There's the people around us that might initially have some adjustments to make as we're healing. And those relationships will, get off balance, but they'll rebalance themselves, right? Yeah. You'll sort of renegotiate the dynamics, and it might take conversations. And you figure out very quickly who it's safe to have those conversations with, someone who's willing to have a reciprocal discussion or a back and forth, someone who is open. Yeah. Those dynamics get renegotiated and the relationships can readjust. And it's beautiful when that happens. Yeah. The ones that don't, this is what's so difficult. Of course, with friendships, it's easier for us to either distance and say, like, you know what, this is a person I'm not going to discuss like certain topics with, or we're only going to see each other this many times a month or a year. And you can get space, or if you choose, you walk away from that friendship. Family is very different. It's much more complicated. We're much more intertwined. Most of us want to be connected to our families, despite maybe years of pain and generational trauma that's there. Most of us don't want to go no contact or have heavy distance. But there comes a point in your healing, if you're really doing the work to go back to some of those old wounds, heal those younger versions of yourself, and discover like who your authenticity is under all those layers of who you had to become to survive all of that. You can't unsee your authenticity. Meaning, once you start to find those parts of yourself, it is that much harder to quiet them or hide them or silence yourself. And that doesn't mean that you go into every family function trying to blow things up and point every pattern out, but it does.
Tables.
Exactly.
That's what you do at first, right? That's the first step.
Let it all fall. But it does mean you probably are in a place where you're no longer able to suppress and disconnect from patterns or certain dynamics where there's been pain in your life.
Yeah.
So for those people, I think depending on who the person is, their personality traits, their trauma, their dysfunction, you might have conversations with certain family members, without someone actively knowing, hey, I've got a parent who's like actually narcissistic or who's really emotionally immature. In the absence of that, generally, like, we want people to start in the least kind of aggressive way, where you are talking to people, you are making requests and having conversations where it's kind of a two-way street. Before we talk about external boundary or very explicit external boundaries, where we're saying, if you do this or if you choose to continue speaking to me this way, I am going to leave.
Right.
And then inevitably, if those things don't work with someone, I often end up talking with people about your internal boundaries, where you're no longer asking someone to change, right? Because as you said, we're only in charge of ourselves. So that's the request. A boundary is saying, this is what I'm going to do. Yeah. But if those things, expressing those things creates more conflict, more escalation, or they're used against you because you're essentially revealing your vulnerabilities in those boundaries,
right,
then we shift to internal boundaries, which is so much more about, I'm going to expect that person to act just as they do. These are the things I'm going to remind myself of, right? When I feel this way or this way, I'm going to offer comfort and validation and soothe myself. I'm going to decide how much time and energy I'm going to invest in this person. Yeah. Right? All sorts of things that are just your internal process. On the surface, it can look like, hey, this person is just sort of like letting this happen. But really, there's so much going on under the surface where they're doing actually a lot of reparenting inside of themselves in the moment or after the fact. If they're choosing to navigate how to stay connected, but still stay rooted in themselves and their authenticity. And it's really complicated. Like, it's not a straight line.
It's complicated.
It's a whole course.
Let's talk about healing, because you just touched on that, reparenting yourself. And, I think there's this nuance again, and this comes from a personal experience, and this is applicable for women as well. But as a man, I entered this world and was told, if you cry, you're a pussy. Mm-hmm. And when you do get upset, you need to go to your room and sit in the corner until you figure it out and come out, right? So there's no support for emotional attunement and connection with self. Yeah. And so when I started therapy, I spent the better part of a decade basically telling the therapist all the things I knew about myself, and this is what happened, and this is why I am the way I am, and like, yeah, I'm just there, to the point where, like, I had a therapist like, I guess that's just is what it is, right? And after many more modalities later, I had some experiences where I was like, I was wrong about everything. I closed off everything, and I locked that door tighter than I could ever imagine. And I think that there's a nuance between someone going back and facing trauma and re-experiencing the emotions and then reparenting and reconnecting and practicing that, and someone being aware of what might have caused them trauma, or maybe the event that actually did cause them trauma, but they're like cut off from the neck to the body. And they're like, why would I focus on those things? I'll just focus on changing my actions. And then that's the solution to it. And it's becoming big in social media right now too, where I'm hearing therapists and people with, education saying we're focusing too much on this. And I'm like, wow, like, I don't think we're focusing enough on it, to be totally honest. So, speaking to all this, how do you approach getting someone into an authentic state of healing? And what are some of the modalities that you might tell our listeners about that could be helpful for them?
And I do want to know if you can focus too much on that. I think that would be...
Okay.
I wonder. I do. I don't... It's not my area.
Okay. If I forget to come back around to that when you ask me.
Yes.
So how do we get people in touch with the things that they're cut off from, essentially, is what you're asking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I come back to what we were talking about a few moments ago, actually, is those embodied practices are the doorway in. Because you can cognitively have a story of, I had a wonderful childhood, we had a close family, I lived here, I did this, I had this hard event, but like I've gotten through it and I'm good, and like
Totally.
I overcame it, and I have this, I have a little anxiety because of this, right? It's all cognitive. But if you actually drop into the body, you're getting a different story. Maybe you're getting numbness and complete disconnect. Maybe you're seeing someone hunch over in shame and pulling their body in. Or even though they're telling this story, there's a thought pattern that doesn't fit with the story that they're telling. So usually we have some tidbit of information, even if it's just a general sense of like, everything's fine in my life, but I just feel horrible. Right? There's just this like stuckness or unhappiness, and I just can't figure out what it is. It tells us there's something there, something we haven't gotten to or touched on. So for me, the doorway in, again, we always want to meet people where they are. Some people take a lot of time to be able to, or be willing to go into your body, but your body is really a very quick way in, honest way into what your experience is holding, because that's where your memory is held in a completely uncomplicated way. The mind is so much more complex, the way we sort of trick ourselves or we make meaning and interpret things, but the body just gives us cleaner information in a way. So for me, that's generally the process is, again, we're coming back to reconnecting really physically with the body and what it's telling us, the sensations and the stories that it is holding. And usually what we find, right? So for example, if you're working with someone and you're encouraging them to go towards something that's happening in their body, and then suddenly it's like everything just went blank. You're like, I lost it. I can't get to it. That's really great information, because what we know then is some version of a protector just came in as you got close to a specific emotion, memory, or event, came in to protect you from that. Right? And then we can start to recognize like, oh, how has this particular protective part shown up in your life? What else does that look like? Well, it does this. It keeps me logical. It keeps me busy. Like I'm always thinking and planning and doing the next thing, for example. Right? None of us do that.
It's like,
so even as we're going towards the body and you hit all these stops, you're getting so much information about the ways that your body, your system learn to protect itself from pain and learn to survive. So even that intellectualization, we can think about that as a protective part to work with. And that's the key, is so many of us, especially if you've had trauma, we are so much more compassionate to other people than to ourselves. And when we come across a part of ourselves that is based on our survival, we can be so quick to shame it, judge it, want to just get rid of it or cut it out. But so much of our work actually is embracing those parts, all parts of yourself, allowing them to be there, because they all carry experience. They all need to be seen and heard, and they have stories about why they're there and why they were needed at the time. And from there, that's where we start to shift more into that reparenting process, is that protective part that was, say is from age 6, learned all these messages. What does it need now so that it can step back, so that it can feel safe and no longer have to work so hard to do the thing that it's been doing for you?
I love that. I think you kind of answered the next question, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I think that what I notice is the more I feel connected to my body and those experiences that did cause me pain, and the more I can work through those, the easier it is to see when someone's stuck in their head about it. Yeah. And I spent a lot of time trying to think through all those traumas, like a lot, like 1,000 hours of time in meditation trying to think through those traumas. And it wasn't until I unlocked my capability to connect with my body from a felt sense and really just let those emotions that have never been processed pour out. And then another year of just basically crying in meditation, every single day, that I was like, oh, okay, now that feels like I'm actually making progress on letting some of those patterns go. And so, speaking to that question, can people get lost in their minds about this and not actually end up getting anywhere because they're neglecting the step of connecting with their bodies where those felt memories are really stored?
100%. And you said it so beautifully. We can just get caught in the thinking of it, where we think we're doing the work because we're addressing it by thinking about it. But you know, as you're talking about being embodied, feeling is not a thinking process. Feeling is actually in your body, which most of us were not taught. Like, I don't remember ever being taught that my feelings were in my body as a kid.
No.
Right? It was like this thing you put this cognitive label to. So I think most of us who are doing this work are going through a process where we're recognizing, if I'm going to process and move through a trauma, or move through, whatever stress or experience, feeling my feelings to get through it actually involves me feeling feelings in my body, feeling sensations in my body, which is exactly why the body is so important in doing trauma work. Otherwise, all we're doing is getting caught in thought. And for most of us, thought is going to be a place of increased stress and just a loop that is not going to get us anywhere. But it is so protective. And I also want to say that for anyone who might find themselves doing that, to recognize there's nothing wrong with you for doing that. You just have a really, really strong protector who's keeping you out of your body. And so what we might do is just get really curious as you notice that, right? Because that's part of our practice is I'm noticing I'm not in my body. I'm noticing I'm just in my thinking. Is can we get curious about what might be underneath that, right? Yeah. How is that serving you in some way?
Do you think it's important because of that, like to sort of work with a professional when you're trying to really, get through these traumas and move through I can definitely, like, you start talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, I have definitely done a loop on certain things and aspects of like my
I just do this, and if I just do that.
Because cognitively, but you're right. We didn't grow up with like, oh, trauma in the body, and we grew up with the separation of mind and body for sure. They're two separate entities. We treat them like they
no pain,
don't engage. It's like, mind over matter, all of that, like all of the conditioning we received as little tiny humans and young adults has like made it, we're like, this is like mind-blowing work to us. Like, oh my God, I feel feelings in my body. What? Like, it doesn't even. So do you, because of the chances, people are listening to this and maybe they're just becoming aware of things, but because of the opportunity to like end up sort of stuck in that loop and maybe feeling worse in some ways, do you always recommend people do this type of trauma work with a trained professional so that they have some guidance through the process so you actually work through it?
I think in an ideal world, you have someone there in a role that's guiding you, who has training in trauma. I know that's not always possible for everyone, so I want to be mindful of that as well. And that's why I always say any practice that gets you, encourages you to be slightly connected to yourself, even if it's just a walk in nature, right? Something that's generally free and available to most of us. If you can start with those small things, or you feel like you have some capacity to sit for a meditation, even for 5 minutes, there are so many ways that you can start that process on your own. I think when we have someone there, it helps us when we're in our own autopilot, right? Like, you can't see what you can't see when you're caught in it. But when you have someone who asks you a question and they watch how you respond, or watch how you skip over something, or watch you move right out of your body into your mind and can gently comment on that and redirect you, that's so helpful. Because otherwise we can get stuck just unknowingly. Like, we're doing the best we can, but we're also trying to go towards something very vulnerable. And that's activating all the ways that we've learned to protect ourselves. So all those things naturally are going to come in as we're trying to do that self-facilitated healing work. So it can be tricky, but you certainly can start that process on your own.
That's good.
So we run these feel-good challenges where people watch our social media and they think to themselves like, oh, I'm going to do one of these moves, and like maybe we'll do this a fitness challenge, and then by like week 2 we're talking about intentions and community and beliefs and all these different things, right? It's the Trojan horse into helping people find a better sense of self-appreciation, right? And one of the things that comes from hosting these events is an awareness that so many people just don't like themselves. They don't value themselves. They don't have self-worth. And, our thesis here is that this is the reason why people don't take care of themselves, because they don't value themselves. And so if we don't work on self-worth, then somebody will always be doing little bursts of motivation, usually rooted in self-hatred and insecurity and judgment, right? How do you see that in your practice? Because it's so prevalent. It like breaks my heart to see how many people just, they look at themselves in the mirror and they don't like themselves. And then their whole life becomes an act of supporting that belief.
Yeah. So, I mean, so much of that is in my practice, again, because I work primarily with childhood trauma or attachment related trauma and wounds, because that's where we start those beliefs typically is, whether a parent was emotionally neglectful or you were the scapegoat in your family or you had to be the golden child, or a parent was actively or a grandparent was actively abusive to you. All of those things inform your sense of self. Am I protected? Am I worthy of protection? Are my needs important? Is my voice important? Do I matter? Am I good enough? Right? All these things that start to swirl around in our internal system. And at the core of so much of it, especially for trauma survivors, is very deep, deep shame. Right? A sense, not just a sense of I'm not good enough or I'm unworthy, but a sense that I'm inherently or deeply flawed or bad in some way. And shame is one of the hottest emotions for any of us to feel and to work with. What I see personally and professionally as a very helpful practice in starting to navigate through that is starting to build a self-compassion practice. Mm-hmm. And self-compassion is so tied up in reparenting because essentially, I mean, the link there is as you're reparenting, right? So you're sitting here in this adult body and you carry all these beliefs. There's shame underneath it all about who you are. That's not your adult self, right? That's your younger self at whatever ages those wounds happened. So our reparenting practice is actually going back in to connect with that younger self who carries all those beliefs and hearing them, seeing them, speaking to them, taking care of them in a way that a healthy, loving parent would. Yeah. Right? So if you try to say to your adult self, like, you're worthy, you're good enough, you're like, I don't fucking believe that. Excuse me. Right? It just bounces right off you. It doesn't mean something. But if you can go internally and connect with the experience of that younger you get connected into your body, you get connected into emotion. And it is much harder to say horrible, awful things that most of us say to ourselves to a cute, innocent child, which we all were. So that's typically how in my practice, when it comes up, we do start working with this is a self-compassion practice, reparenting. And through that, what we start to see over time, even if you're not directly doing cognitive work, is you start to see those shifts cognitively, where when you're taking care of that child and you're asking like, hey, what do you need today? Even if they don't have an answer for you, just dropping that question, having that intention for someone to care or to be curious about you starts to build a sense of worthiness or that you're important. So over time, you do start to see those beliefs shift, but it's also accompanied with this ability to motivate yourself with compassion instead of criticism, which I think is directly related to what you were talking about with these challenges.
I love that. I so appreciate you sharing that because I think we all need to be a lot kinder to ourselves. And I think it will be the thing that serves us and helps us change the world in a much more meaningful way. Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today. I feel like this went by so fast and we could talk and talk and talk and talk. But where can people find you if they're interested in learning more?
You can find me on Instagram or TikTok at Dr. Deniz Ahmadinia. My link tree on there has all sorts of links to free downloads if you want some ebooks and PDFs. I have some master classes, a 6-month program. I have a free workshop that's coming up on the 16th that people can join on dysfunctional families, and lots of free content in my email newsletter as well.
Amazing.
I love that. Thank you
so much for your time today. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.